Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of the On the Pony Express podcast. I am Billy Embody. Thanks for listening. Got a lot to get to on this podcast. We are going to preview the safety position for SMU because it is now finalized for spring ball. And so we do want to go ahead and jump into that. But first, we have to mention that National Signing Day wrapped up on Wednesday. SMU finished with the number 2 class in the AAC, just behind UTSA, with the Roadrunners grabbing a 4-star offensive lineman out of the JUCO ranks that really helped their class finish number 1 in the AAC. But the Mustangs finished number 2, also have a strong portal class. When it comes to overall talent, there's no question the Mustangs brought in the most in the AAC in the 2023 recruiting cycle. SMU just finishing short of that number 1 ranking in the AAC. But look, they jumped up to number 2 because of their big addition on National Signing Day. That is Adam Moore out of the Sunshine State, the Miami Northwestern wide receiver, tight end. Picked the Mustangs just kind of how we predicted it last week as we put in our On3 recruiting prediction machine pick for the Mustangs before he even went on his Syracuse official visit. He announced for the Mustangs about 10 a.m. Central Time, giving them another versatile tight end in this class for Casey Woods. The ties with SMU's coaching staff all to that Miami area when they were there in Coral Gables really stood out here. Big group effort to get Adam Moore on board. Rhett Lashley and some of the coaching staff went in home with him right before that Syracuse official visit. He goes up, checks out what was a chilly Syracuse town in January, and obviously ends up picking Dallas on a day where most of the city is shut down for this ice storm that we've been going through. So Adam Moore, 6'3", 220-pound pass catcher, gets into the mix for SMU's recruiting class, bolsters them up to the number 2 class overall. Funny enough, he does have a tie with one of SMU's commitments, but it's in the class of 2024. Tyler Aronson, the quarterback commit for the Mustangs in 2024, played with him on the Miami Immortals 7-on-7 team. They've got a nice connection with that 7-on-7 program. So hopefully something that keeps Tyler Aronson on board, who will visit during spring practice as well. So he'll be back on the hilltop here shortly to continue to build those relationships with the staff. But look, SMU wraps up a relatively quiet National Signing Day. There was no press conference with Rhett Lashley because of the weather. That's going to be on February 15th. So be sure to check back at ontheponyexpress.com as our coverage for the 2023 class is not technically over yet. We'll hear from Rhett Lashley and some of the staff on this recruiting class that they reeled in. Again, that finishes number 2 in the AAC. Lamadrick Spencer, the Duncanville defensive back, did sign non-binding papers with the Mustangs on National Signing Day. He has some admissions things to work through. He was, again, somebody that for grades hasn't been able to commit to SMU until last month. Felt good enough about it to take him. They feel good about him joining the class officially at some point here, but they do have to wait a little bit longer for him to officially be announced as a member of the class, but he is all locked in. He told me he signed his papers with SMU. So he's going to be a Mustang as long as things work out on his end of things for the admissions and getting, the rest of his grades all tidied up there during his senior spring semester here. So that is a nice addition, but if you didn't see him announced as a signee, that's why. SMU, quite honestly, with those 2 guys jumping on board late, 2 nice additions, one on each side of the ball to round out this recruiting class with 17 guys locked in. I broke down all the players in this recruiting class, a little synopsis on how they got to SMU and signed with the Mustangs at ontheponyexpress.com. Check that out. Try us free for 7 days, then $10 a month after that. Next week, we do have our subscriber get-together. Was hoping to have heard from Rhett Lashley before that, but check out the board with more details on that. We're going to get together and talk about this class and talk about what's next as spring ball gets closer. And we're going to jump in to previewing that safety room. But first, we do have to address that Liberty defensive back, Rocket Rahimi, is not going to be a part of SMU. Some issues kind of holding him up from continuing to play college football. So he's going to try his hand at the NFL via the supplemental draft. He's changed his bio on his Twitter, and I've confirmed with sources that he is not going to end up at SMU, barring some last-minute change. So they're going to miss out on a key piece for that safety room. We've talked about them wanting to address that position still in the transfer portal, and I would expect in May, once some new faces enter the portal, we'll see them try to do that on that front. And last podcast, when we previewed National Signing Day, we talked about some of the biggest needs and remaining transfer targets out there. So we're not going to do all of that again. But I do want to jump in and preview what is going to be, in my opinion, the most interesting position group on campus this spring, the safety position, because you have added so much talent. You have some key players coming back off the 2022 team, and you have added some defensive backs that provide versatility in this group. So how does it shake out? Who rises to the top? And that's something we won't really be able to know until, quite honestly, fall camp, by the time they've gone through another full offseason of workouts and certainly, another full summer with Scott Simons, who is now the safeties coach for SMU. This is a group that, when you look at the returners right now, and this is who I for sure know is going to play safety, Brian Massey comes back after a season he probably wants back. He got hurt in fall camp. He wasn't the same after that, and certainly had some issues tackling, ended up getting benched for Ahmad Moses, the true freshman who played really well down the stretch for the Mustangs after flipping late in the recruiting cycle from UTSA. SMU got him on board. Then Brandon Crosley, who played nickel last year, and SMU really felt good about how he finished his season off. Then you have Isaiah Wacobia. Could he play linebacker if he bulks up? Maybe, but as of now, it seems like he's set to play safety this spring. You also have Chris Adamora coming back from the 2022 team. He could very well end up playing linebacker. He's just such a big safety back there. So he is another one to watch, potential move. We'll kind of keep an eye on those guys and kind of where they, fit in on this defense for Scott Simons, as he's now had a full year to really see what he's got. Departures from the group: Roderick Robertson out the door. Donald Clay is out the door. Obviously, Chase Cromartie left during the season as well. So those guys are gone, but SMU did add Abdul Muhammad in the 2023 recruiting class. He'll arrive in June, though. And so that is a lone safety commit or signing they got. So now we just look at these transfers who will be here for spring practice. And let's start with Jonathan McGill, a Stanford captain. He's coming back home. I think he fits right into kind of that free safety spot, maybe nickel, but most likely free safety. Scott Simons telling me, kind of wants him to not be forced to be in the run fits at strong safety. He has had some injury things here or there throughout his career, but really views him as that key piece at free safety for SMU, with a little bit of versatility there as well. He's played a ton of football in his career. And then you have CJ Sanders, who could very well end up playing some safety for SMU. He played corner at Fresno State, but he does have that versatility and wants to play all over. He could play nickel. He could play free safety as well. 5'10", 170. I think he comes in and potentially factors in at nickel and pushes Brandon Crosley a little bit. And then this is kind of where it gets interesting. Jalen Davis Robinson, a guy who came to LSU as a cornerback. Where does he fit in this secondary? He, at least when I saw him when he was going off to LSU, really big corner by that point. He had bulked up, put on some weight, and I think he could be one that plays safety as well. So when you factor those guys in, who are all here this spring, the only other defensive back I didn't mention is Chris Meganson from Liberty and Charles Woods from West Virginia. Both of those guys are going to be corners in all likelihood. Now you have this interesting group where you bring in potentially 3 new safeties, all of whom can potentially start. Obviously, they brought in Nick Roberts, who did just that last year. He's another departure off that group. But what does Brian Massey look like this spring? What does Brandon Crosley bring to the table at nickel in another year in this system? Ahmad Moses, you got to believe and hope he's going to take that next step at the safety position after finishing that season very, very strong. I'm really intrigued to see what the pecking order kind of looks like. It's going to be a relatively thin group, but one factor here to watch is, do they move somebody like a Bryce McMorris to safety? That is a move that could happen. He played safety in high school. He is coming off a torn ACL. SMU added a bunch of corners as well, 2 starters in Chris Meganson and Charles Woods. We previewed that position on an earlier edition of our spring preview podcast for positions. But as far as safety goes, it's probably a little bit easier for him to see the field, especially with that strong safety spot. You have Ahmad Moses and Brian Massey who played that last year. But Brian Massey didn't have the best season by any means. We all know that. He knows that. And then you have Ahmad Moses who came on really strong. But, I mean, is that really just it? You need a third in that group to step up. We saw them play Roger Roberson a good bit. Donald Clay saw a little bit of time. But that is a position that is still up for grabs. And really all of them are in the safety group with the free, the nickel, and the strong. Scott Simons really wants guys that can play all three and they can be versatile and be moved around and do a bunch of different things. And I feel like with this group, you kind of have that. You have a Jonathan McGill who can slide down and play nickel. You have a CJ Sanders who can slide down and play nickel, but they can also play free. You have Brandon Crosley who has some corner experience, but has really settled into that nickel spot. Can he maybe play a little bit of free? Chris Adamora, he's got some versatility, but again, does he play linebacker? I think this group has so many questions as to who rises to the top, and you also have so much versatility that they've added into the mix for this group. So I just feel like this is that most interesting group as far as what they need to accomplish this spring. And one thing I feel like with Scott Simons taking over this position, which is very critical in terms of communication, you can tell that Scott Simons wants to fix this position group himself. And there were options out there for SMU to hire. Could have been a safeties coach, with prior defensive coordinator experience. Could have, done what they did. Hire Maurice Crum to take over that linebacker group, and Scott Simons moved back to safety. They had options. And Scott Simons opts to take on the safety position, which I think it really says a lot about kind of how he feels about what needs to be fixed and who needs to fix it and kind of where it all lies. And he wants to take that on. And so now it is about cleaning up so much of what they really struggled with last year, which is tackling, communication at times. This group has a chance to be very good with the talent, just pure talent they added and continued development of a guy like Ahmad Moses. Maybe Brian Massey bounces back and quite frankly, puts it together in tackling. I mean, that's his big thing. He was still one of the team's top tacklers, and he missed so many tackles. Brandon Crosley, he brings that edge. He needs to keep that consistency on the up in terms of how he finished this past year. He needs to bring more consistency to that position group. And then you factor in all the players that they brought in. I think this is a group that now has upside. And the corner position is a little different, where you have a lot of guys that have played a bunch of football that have been tried, been tested, but they just kind of are what they are. They add in Chris Meganson, who's played at a high level for Liberty, and then they add in Charles Woods, who has a ton of potential. That group is kind of based on staying healthy. This group, save for Jonathan McGill, has been pretty healthy and been able to play, a lot of football. Brian Massey just wasn't 100% off of that ankle in fall camp, but didn't miss time, really. You have Jonathan McGill, who showed this past season he can play and be durable. He had an injury that really held him back in that 2021 season, I think it was. But for the most part, has been available his whole career. So what has to happen with this group is they all have to communicate at a very high level, and the tackling has got to improve. And in talking with multiple coaches just kind of toward the end of the season, you get the feeling that tackling is not going to be something they shy away from in spring ball. That's the biggest thing I'm watching across the board on defense. Last year, they were still getting to know each other. They were still trying to find their way in this new defense. And they were also very thin last year. There were a lot of transfers that came in late for SMU that weren't necessarily there to participate in spring practice. And they kind of had to take it easy in that sense as well. now you have a group that is all here for spring ball. You've got to be able to address those issues with tackling. When you look back, the top returning tackler out of this safety group is Brandon Crosley, who had 42 last year. He had 5 pass breakups and an interception. Brian Massey was right behind him with 40 tackles in 11 games. So really a higher tackle per game rate for him, and had 1 pass breakup. And then going down the list, you have Roger Robertson, who's moving on. Ahmad Moses played in all 13 games, made 27 tackles and a pass breakup. That is a group that I feel like, looking at that on paper, so much of some of the breakdowns in pass coverage and opportunities to make plays on the ball were because of communication. And that's something that has to improve. And that's why it's very important that Scott Simons is taking on this role as far as how he's going to fix it and how he's going to address the issues that he saw on his end with the safety group. He coached safeties at West Georgia. He's done it before. He's not a stranger coming in to this position group. And if you look at what SMU is bringing in with these transfers, I see Jonathan McGill, named a captain at Stanford, former Coppell standout, really is the one that I think has a chance to be a true difference maker. I spoke with Scott Simons for a story at ontheponyexpress.com about him, and we dropped it earlier, I think last month or early January. And Jonathan McGill has not let up in terms of wanting to know the playbook, wanting to get his hands on all the film he can, wanting to learn and get ready for this, quite frankly, I believe it's a 2-year job interview. He played in 12 games as a freshman. 2020 doesn't count. His junior year, he redshirted because of that injury that held him back, but returned to play the final 2 games of the season, and then played in 2022 and was a captain for Stanford. So he has 2 years of eligibility remaining for SMU. He doesn't want to have an adjustment period. He's a very bright young man, graduated from Stanford, and now you want to see him take on a leadership role right when he gets here. You want to see him slide into that captain spot potentially for SMU. Jimmy Phillips is out the door. There's a spot open on defense for that without a doubt. And one thing that stands out as well is that drive. And I think the group needs more of that. And I think they injected a good bit of that into this room when it comes to the transfers. CJ Sanders is another one that Scott Simons told me. He says, I don't care where I play. Corner, nickel, free, strong, doesn't matter to me. I just want to get on the field. So he's somebody that could very well end up learning every position in the secondary for SMU. And he's been a starter the last 2 years at Fresno State, and a very productive one at that. So I feel like with those 2 guys right off the bat, you have injected competitiveness and leadership into this room, which Nick Roberts brought it in a big way this past season. He was on guys. He made plays. He had issues, like it wasn't perfect, but he was a very competitive, physical player when he needed to be. And I feel like that was important that SMU added that back in to this room. And I think they kind of nailed that in terms of the competitiveness with Jonathan McGill and CJ Sanders. That is, when it comes to how they addressed in the portal, kind of top to bottom across the roster as an aside, something I feel like they did fairly well with. They brought in Keyshawn Smith, Jalen Knighton, the Miami defensive lineman as well, Jordan Miller and Elijah Roberts. They brought in some of these players that have really shown at a higher level that they can play and they want to be great. And that's why they came to SMU. They trust this staff. And I feel like the staff, one thing and it just kind of happens with, as you come in as a new coaching staff, there's just little parts of the program that aren't maybe all the way bought in. We've seen a lot of departures of some players that I feel like just, hadn't done enough at SMU and weren't doing enough to really raise their level of game to that level that is needed to be successful. And I feel like with a lot of these transfer additions, they're bringing in players that want to raise that competitive level at SMU. So I'm very intrigued to see how the safety room pans out. When it comes to Jalen Davis Robinson, I think with his speed, obviously he could see the field at corner. He has that elite track speed that you want at the corner position. But I feel like with how thick he is, it wouldn't shock me if he ended up playing some safety. And the wild card is Bryce McMorris. By the time the bowl game rolled around and prep was going, he was kind of running, jogging with the team. So I think he's going to be good to go for spring practice. Maybe they keep him in a red jersey, non-contact. But in terms of getting back and getting healthy, it seemed like he was on the right track. So if he ends up at that safety position, that's another piece that can factor into that competitiveness and competition that's going to go on at this whole group of the safety room. The player that I think is going to take the biggest step up this upcoming season at the safety position is Ahmad Moses. I was very high on him coming out of high school when he flipped from UTSA to SMU, and you could just see it. He's not the long, rangy safety that a lot of teams covet, but he's a really smart football player, a very physical football player. And he, as the season went on, really impressed SMU as far as how he bought in, how he was pushing. He never gave up pushing Brian Massey, and he ends up starting, I believe, the last couple games for him and earning himself those extra reps. I think Ahmad Moses is poised to take that big step forward in 2023. That's kind of similar to how I talked about Brian Massey, minus the fact that Brian Massey had the return game element to his repertoire of talent coming off of the 2021 season. I expected Brian Massey to take a step forward. That didn't happen. He got hurt in fall camp. And then from there, just never panned out in the 2022 season. And the thing about Brian Massey is, and you can ask casual fan, hardcore fan, coaching staff, who the best player was in fall camp for SMU last year before he got hurt? Brian Massey. It wasn't Rashee Rice. It was Brian Massey. And that just stands out to me. And look, sometimes it doesn't all come together for players, and tackling is one of those hard things that players either have or they don't. Brian Massey has to prove it that he does, but he was somebody that was on the rise going into the season, and who knows how it would have panned out if he would have stayed healthy. But he does have that potential to get back to that. I do feel that. So he's going to be one to watch to see how he responds with new competition, new faces in the room, and see if he can take his game to the next level. Brandon Crosley's coming off a finish to the 2022 season that I think is overlooked. And I went back and watched a couple games, and he just did some of the little things that they really worked with him all season or all season long with him on to improve. And he started doing those well. I felt like he was a better tackler at the end of the season. He really kind of bought into sticking his nose in there a little bit more. Again, wasn't perfect. The entire defense wasn't. I mean, you go watch that Tulane game and it was bad. But I do feel like he balanced that edge that he plays with as far as, talking trash, being loud, being in people's faces with actual, production and backing it up. So I think Brandon Crosley, you go back and watch some of those final games of the season, and he was certainly, a big part of, I feel like, the win over Memphis, had 5 tackles, had an interception, 2 pass breakups. I mean, that's the big, cap to the season for him, coming off a Tulane game where he had just 1 tackle and 1 pass breakup. So he bounced back and was able to do some things well. And I feel like it's lost in some of the inconsistency. And if he can put it all together, he's going to be a good one. Said this for a while. He's a 4-star coming out of high school. He's a nickel. I think that's where he's slotted. That's where he's best at. And he's got some competition now. So how does he respond? That's going to be interesting. I think he's one of the emerging leaders of this team and is starting to push his energy in the right direction. And we'll see. The wild cards out there right now, Isaiah Wacobia, Chris Adamora, what do they do? How do they fit in? Because right now they haven't shown enough to really be considered factors in the safety position race. So if Chris Adamora or Isaiah Wacobia moves up to linebacker, wouldn't shock me at all at a position that is very thin depth-wise. Obviously, Isaiah battled that hamstring issue where he kind of, got shut down after the first 4 games, and that whole situation unfolded. But if he does intend to stay at SMU, he's got to respond, and he needs to respond in a big way. He was one of the guys that got a big NIL deal to not go to TCU and, ended up really not doing anything. Nick Roberts came in, impressed. Brandon Crosley held on to a nickel spot. Brian Massey was a starter at one point as well. And Ahmad Moses, outplayed him as well at that safety spot. So, and they had Roger Robertson, who was getting some burn as well. So he did not factor in really at all, like he would have liked to in 2022. He didn't get as many opportunities. And I just feel like he's got to find something in his game that he can bring to the table at a high level. Could be linebacker, could be like a pass coverage will linebacker, a situational guy that SMU can deploy at times. But he's got to find his footing again if he ends up, sticking with SMU. Obviously, there's another transfer portal window, May 1st to the 15th. And who knows, there could be other players that leave, and Isaiah Wacobia stays at SMU for the rest of his career. But with the way it's trending with this competition they've added to the room, he's got to be somebody that is sitting there saying, how am I going to see the field? So that is kind of going to do it. I think I ran down every player that's going to be involved in this safety competition or could be. So we'll be interested to see how that pans out. Spring practice now just a few weeks away. One final thought on the safety group. I think when you're looking at a potential who's going to be the all-AAC guy, I'm going to take an early stab at predicting that Jonathan McGill is going to be that guy. He's somebody that's coming back home. He's highly motivated to go to the NFL and get that fresh start. The coaching change at Stanford. He's going to play his final 2 seasons at SMU in front of his, friends and family from back home in Coppell. I think Jonathan McGill is poised for some big things, and it's going to be interesting to finally see him suit up for SMU with that jersey on in practice and actually be on campus after being a one-time commit. So Jonathan McGill, an early bold prediction perhaps for the 2023 season. I think he's your all AAC guy. Biggest concern of the group is they don't turn the corner on tackling, and the newcomers aren't what they thought. That's obviously what we're all watching for, is how those guys transition into the defense. But I do feel like they've added enough talent to really solidify this group for the next couple of years and really rework this safety group. It's been a masterful job. It's too bad it didn't work out with Rocket Rahimi. We'll see if anything pans out there, that he finds his way to SMU in the end. But the group that they brought in, and now this kind of completes our whole corner and safety previews for the spring ball. But that whole group is just completely reworked. And if they pan out, that's going to be a large reason why this defense is potentially going to be much improved in 2023. So with that, guys, going to wrap up this edition of the podcast. We mixed a little recruiting with a spring position preview to put it all together for you in one pod. But next week, we'll start looking ahead more to spring practice. The Mustangs are going to be on the practice field before we know it. Probably, I think, 4 weeks, 3-4 weeks away, 3 weeks probably, with February being the short month. So we'll get deeper into previews as well for the spring ball, and also we'll do a mailbag edition of the podcast. So definitely subscribe to ontheponyexpress.com. And I'll tell you this, only 55% of you guys that watch our podcast on our YouTube channel subscribe to our podcast on the YouTube channel. So hit the subscribe button. It's right below the title of this podcast. There's a link that says subscribe to On the Pony Express' YouTube channel. Hit that for me, please. Appreciate you guys that have already done that. We are well on our way to 500 subscribers for the YouTube channel. Keep growing this thing. Appreciate all you guys who have listened. Puts a wrap on the 2023 recruiting class. We're on to 2024. Lots of coverage on that to come on the site as well. So thanks for listening, guys, and have a great weekend. And we'll catch you next.